A racist police officer assumes a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him without cause. Later, he realizes that the man he just arrested is an FBI agent. This story not only exposes the prejudice and unprofessional behavior of the officer, but also serves as a reminder of the consequences of baseless biases in society. Bookmark, go back. If you found this story interesting, comment with 1. If you found it very interesting, comment with 2. And feel free to share your own stories with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to not miss any upcoming inspirational stories. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. The afternoon sun bathed Riverside Park in a gentle golden light. Alex, with his short dark hair and relaxed posture, was dressed casually in a light blue shirt and jeans, blending in with the peaceful surroundings. Trees swayed slightly with the breeze, their leaves rustling softly above children playing nearby. It was a peaceful scene, full of laughter and the quiet energy of a community enjoying the end of the day. Amidst the lively greenery, Alex Johnson sat alone on a weathered bench, deeply immersed in his book. Alex was a composed figure, his presence understated but noticeable. With his calm demeanor, he appeared completely at ease. It was as though the world around him had slowed down to match his pace. He wore a light smile as he read, turning each page with deliberate care, savoring each word. For Alex, this park had always been a refuge, a place where he could escape the demands of his work and immerse himself in the simple joy of reading. Bookmark. The scene painted a portrait of tranquility, sunlight filtering through the branches above, casting patterns of light and shadow across the bench. Birds sang in the distance, and the faint sound of children playing gave life to the setting. To anyone passing by, Alex appeared lost in a rare moment of stillness, a reminder of how simple pleasures could make the world fade away. Officer Tom Wilson took a deep breath as he made up his mind to approach the man on the bench. There was something about Alex Johnson's demeanor that unnerved him. It wasn't just the calmness, it was the way Alex looked at him, without fear, almost as if he was expecting Tom's scrutiny. That look made Tom's steps grow more purposeful, his expression hardening as he moved closer. The park seemed to grow quieter as Tom approached. His uniformed figure cut through the calm atmosphere, his gaze locked firmly on Alex, who remained seated, his eyes following the officer's every step. Tom couldn't help but feel a growing unease, but he pushed it aside, telling himself he was simply doing his job. He reminded himself that his duty was to protect the community, and that sometimes meant questioning things that seemed out of place, even if it made him uncomfortable. This was part of the job, being vigilant, even when doubts gnawed at him. It was his responsibility to keep the park safe, and that meant questioning anything or anyone that seemed out of place. Alex sat up a bit straighter as Tom closed the distance, his hands resting openly on the book in his lap. His expression remained composed, his eyes steady and his lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile, suggesting a calm confidence. He watched the officer with a measured calm, his eyes unblinking. Tom came to a stop a few feet away, his stance slightly rigid, the baton at his side almost an afterthought but still noticeable. "Afternoon," Tom said, his voice polite but with an unmistakable edge. He studied Alex's face, trying to find a hint of nervousness or guilt, something that would validate his instincts. But Alex just nodded, his voice even as he responded. "Afternoon, officer." The words hung between them, a polite exchange that carried with it the tension of unspoken suspicions. Tom knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation, and as he stood there, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Alex Johnson could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change that pulled him away from the world of his book. The distant laughter of children playing faded, and the rustling leaves seemed to grow quieter, as if the park itself was holding its breath. The sensation of being watched was undeniable, like a prickle at the back of his neck that refused to fade. He looked up, his eyes scanning the park until they landed on Officer Tom Wilson, who stood at a distance. His gaze locked on Alex. Alex recognized that look. It was the kind of look he had grown accustomed to over the years, a look filled with suspicion, one that carried assumptions without basis. He remembered the time a store manager had followed him through every aisle, or when a neighbor had called the police on him for simply walking in his own neighborhood. These experiences had taught him exactly what that stare meant. He had seen it too many times before, and he could read it as clearly as if the officer had spoken aloud. There was a weight behind the officer's stare that was impossible to ignore. Sighing inwardly, Alex kept his expression neutral. Just stay calm, he thought. Don't give him any reason to escalate this. He wasn't about to show fear or anger, both emotions that he knew could escalate the situation unnecessarily. Instead, he gently closed his book, marking his page with his finger, and looked straight at Officer Wilson. His eyes were calm, steady, and unafraid, a silent statement that he had nothing to hide. Tom's posture remained tense as he watched Alex, his body language betraying his unease. His fists were clenched and his eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of guilt. He seemed to be searching for something, a sign of guilt, a nervous twitch, anything that would validate the suspicion gnawing at him. But Alex gave him none of that. He simply sat there, his gaze unwavering, his body relaxed. Go back. The air between them was thick with tension, ready to tip in either direction. Alex braced himself. He knew that Officer Wilson would eventually come over. He could see it in the determination etched into the officer's face. But Alex wasn't going to be intimidated. He had done nothing wrong, and he intended to face whatever came his way with calm dignity. Officer Tom Wilson took a deep breath as he made his decision to approach Alex Johnson. The unease gnawed at him, and his instincts, honed over years of experience, told him that there was something about this man that required further scrutiny. It was the way Alex's calmness seemed almost rehearsed, as if he was deliberately trying to project innocence. The lack of nervousness, the unflinching gaze, all of it set off alarm bells in Tom's mind. He walked slowly, his eyes locked onto Alex, each step deliberate, as if giving himself time to size up the situation. The park seemed to grow quieter with each step Tom took, as if the surroundings themselves sensed the growing tension. Tom's fingers brushed against his baton, the familiar weight offering a small sense of reassurance as he closed the gap between them. He wasn't sure why Alex unnerved him so much. Perhaps it was the calm demeanor or the way Alex held his gaze without fear. Whatever it was, it made Tom more determined to find out what was going on. Alex saw Tom approaching, and he knew this was inevitable. He sat a little straighter on the bench, his hands resting openly on the closed book in his lap. He wasn't about to give the officer any excuse to claim he felt threatened. Alex could read the determination in Tom's eyes, a mixture of suspicion and a need to assert control. Tom felt that asserting control was necessary to maintain his authority, especially when confronted with someone who challenged his instincts without showing any fear. It was a feeling born out of years of experience where authority had to be upheld, sometimes even when the reasons were unclear. He took a deep breath, willing himself to remain calm. "Afternoon," Tom said as he came to a stop a few feet away. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, one that Alex recognized instantly. He had heard it before, an attempt to mask underlying suspicion. "Afternoon, officer," Alex replied, his voice steady and even. He kept his eyes on Tom, refusing to look away, and made sure his posture remained relaxed. Internally, he reminded himself to breathe steadily, knowing that any sign of tension could be misinterpreted. "Stay calm," he thought. "You've done nothing wrong." He knew the script all too well. Remain calm, cooperate without appearing submissive, and don't let fear show. Tom narrowed his eyes slightly, his unease growing with each second of Alex's unwavering gaze. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Tom asked, his eyes flicking to the book in Alex's lap. He was fishing for something, anything that could give him a reason to escalate the encounter. "Just enjoying the park," Alex answered, keeping his voice calm. "It's a nice day, figured I'd get some reading in." He spoke with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, aware that anything more could be seen as a challenge. Tom nodded, though his suspicion remained. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his posture stiffened, as if bracing himself for whatever might come next. He didn't like the way Alex seemed so composed. There was no fear, no sign of discomfort, only a calm confidence that made Tom uneasy. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his fingers tapping lightly against the baton. "You from around here?" he pressed, his eyes never leaving Alex's face. Alex's smile remained, though his eyes grew a touch colder. "I've been around," he replied, leaving the answer vague on purpose. He could sense Tom's frustration at the non-committal response, but Alex wasn't about to explain himself more than necessary. He knew his rights, and he wasn't obligated to share anything more. Bookmark. The two men locked eyes for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Tom's jaw tightened, and he felt the familiar frustration rise within him. He had approached expecting unease or fear, something that would validate his suspicions. But all he found was composure and an unspoken defiance. And that, more than anything, made him decide that this encounter wasn't over yet. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the silence between them. He hoped that breaking the silence would help reassert his authority, reminding both himself and Alex who was in control here. He needed to break it, to find a way to assert himself in this exchange. The tension was palpable, almost tangible in the air between them, like a rope being pulled from both ends. He decided to push further. "You come here often?" Tom asked, his voice calm, but with an undertone of something sharper, almost a challenge. He was watching Alex carefully, searching for any flicker of unease, any hint that would give him an opening. Alex held Tom's gaze, his face remaining calm, though the hint of tension showed in the tightening of his jaw. He reminded himself to stay composed, knowing that any sign of weakness could be used against him. "Sometimes," he replied, keeping his answer short. He knew what Tom was doing, trying to rattle him, trying to find something that didn't fit. But Alex wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. He kept his posture relaxed, even as he could feel the pressure building, like an invisible force pressing against him. Tom nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Funny, I don't recall seeing you around here before." He leaned in slightly, his tone becoming more pointed. "Mind telling me why you're here today?" Alex's eyes hardened just a bit, his voice steady as he answered, "Like I said, just enjoying the park." He paused, letting the silence fill the space again, the tension thickening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Tom's fingers tapped against the baton at his side, his frustration evident. He was irritated by Alex's unwavering composure, the lack of fear or hesitation that he expected to see. It made him feel as if he was losing authority, and that unsettled him deeply. He didn't like the way Alex was holding his ground. There was no fear, no nervousness, just that same calm defiance that made Tom's instincts flare. He could feel the eyes of a few bystanders on them now, and that only made the pressure to assert control even stronger. "Depends," Tom said, his voice low. He could feel the situation slipping from his grasp, and that thought made him uneasy. "Got any ID on you?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge that Alex knew all too well. Alex took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving Tom's. He straightened his back slightly, his shoulders relaxed, projecting an air of calm despite the tension. He knew this was the moment that could make or break how things would proceed. He could feel his heart pounding, but he kept his expression composed. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. He wanted to make it clear that he knew his rights, that he wasn't going to be intimidated. Tom's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected Alex to push back quite so directly. The silence that followed felt heavy, the tension between them tightening like a coiled spring. A couple walking by glanced their way, their expressions curious, sensing the confrontation brewing. For a moment, neither man spoke. The park seemed to hold its breath, the distant laughter of children and rustle of leaves fading into the background. It was as if the entire world had narrowed to just the two of them, locked in this silent standoff. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice harsher now, the frustration evident. "If you're not doing anything wrong, then you shouldn't mind showing me some ID." It was a familiar line, one meant to force compliance, to push Alex into a corner. Alex's lips pressed into a thin line. He'd heard this before, too many times to count. He knew the game, knew how easily things could spiral if he didn't handle this carefully. He kept his hands visible, his voice calm as he responded. "With all due respect, officer, I'm just sitting here, enjoying my day. I don't see why that requires me to show ID." The words hung heavily between them, a challenge wrapped in politeness. The tension was almost unbearable now, a taut line that could snap at any moment. Tom could feel his control over the situation slipping, and it only made him more determined to find something, anything, that would justify his suspicions. The air seemed to crackle with intensity as Tom stared at Alex, the questions still hanging unanswered between them. Tom's frustration was mounting, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by seeing someone so sure of himself. The tension was electric, like the stillness before a storm. It was time to up the pressure. "I asked you a question, Tom said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the relative quiet of the park. His fingers drummed against the baton on his belt, the rhythmic movement betraying his agitation. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Alex, as if to emphasize his authority. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Alex met his gaze, unflinching. He could feel the intensity radiating off Tom, the demand for submission clear in his eyes. But Alex wasn't about to give in. He knew his rights, and he wasn't about to be bullied into compliance. He took a slow breath, allowing himself a moment before he spoke. "Officer," Alex said evenly, "I'm just sitting in a public park. I haven't done anything wrong." He kept his voice level, his tone respectful but firm, each word carefully measured. "I don't believe I'm required to show ID unless I'm being detained." A flicker of something, anger, maybe frustration, crossed Tom's face. He had expected compliance, maybe even fear, but Alex's steadfast calm was unraveling him. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned in, his face just inches away from Alex's. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, yet laced with menace. The tension between them was nearly unbearable now, a live wire ready to snap. The bystanders nearby exchanged glances, sensing the confrontation escalating, their murmurs creating an undercurrent of unease. Alex could feel his heart pounding, but he refused to let it show. He remained still, his gaze locked on Tom's. "I just know my rights, officer," he replied, his voice steady. A small hook formed in his words, a hint that he wouldn't be easily swayed, an unspoken challenge. Tom's grip on his baton tightened, his knuckles whitening. He could feel the pressure of the eyes on them, the silent judgment of the people around him. He was losing this encounter, and he knew it. His authority was being questioned in a way that left him teetering on the edge of losing control. He needed to do something to reassert himself, to make sure that Alex knew he wasn't in charge here. "I'm not going to ask again," Tom said, his voice low and dangerous. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Alex's face, the tension between them vibrating like a drawn bowstring. "Show me some ID, or I'll have to assume you've got something to hide." Alex sighed, the sound soft but carrying a weight of frustration. He knew where this was heading, could see the path laid out before him like so many times before. But he wouldn't give in, not without a reason. He lifted his chin slightly, his gaze steady. "Unless you have a reason to detain me, I think we're done here." The silence that followed was deafening, the entire park seeming to hold its breath. Tom's eyes blazed with fury, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might snap, the tension reaching a fever pitch. The people nearby had gone quiet, their eyes glued to the unfolding confrontation, anticipation thick in the air. Tom clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, and it enraged him. He wanted to force compliance, to show Alex who was in charge, but something held him back. The eyes of the bystanders, the knowledge that every move he made now was under scrutiny. It was a razor's edge, and he was walking it. "Fine," Tom finally growled, the word escaping through clenched teeth. He took a step back, his eyes still locked on Alex. "But don't think this is over. I'll be watching you." The threat lingered in the air, a promise of future encounters. Alex remained still, his face expressionless. He knew better than to respond, knew that anything he said could set things off again. Instead, he nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement that neither confirmed nor denied anything. It was a delicate balance, a game of survival in moments like these. Tom turned sharply, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he walked away, his back rigid. Alex exhaled, finally allowing his shoulders to relax. He couldn't help but reflect on how close things had come to spiraling out of control. It was always the same, the need to stay composed, to survive these encounters with his dignity intact. The tension slowly began to dissipate, but he knew it was far from over. This was only the beginning. and he could feel it in the way Tom had looked at him, a look that promised this wasn't the last they'd see of each other. Tom's face was flushed as he turned back, frustration boiling over. He felt his authority slipping, and it terrified him. He needed to regain control, to prove that he was still in charge. He couldn't let this end here. He needed to reassert his authority. Alex's calm defiance had pushed him too far. With quick, decisive steps, Tom approached Alex again, his voice clipped. "You're coming with me." Alex looked up, a flicker of disbelief passing over his features. His mind raced, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. How had it escalated to this point? He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, facing the all-too-familiar injustice. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice still even, though a hint of tension colored his tone. Tom didn't respond with words. He grabbed Alex's arm, yanking him up from the bench. The metal handcuffs clicked open, the cold steel finding Alex's wrists with an almost rehearsed efficiency. "Resisting an officer?" Tom muttered, avoiding Alex's gaze as he secured the cuffs. He could feel the eyes of onlookers burning into him, but he ignored them, focusing only on maintaining control. The onlookers were murmuring now, their hushed voices carrying hints of disbelief and shock. "Did he really do something wrong?" one woman whispered, her brows furrowed, while another man shook his head, his face etched with concern. Alex didn't struggle. He stood, his eyes locked forward, his expression a mask of calm. Inside, he felt the anger boiling, but he couldn't let it show. Not here, not now. Tom led Alex away, his grip firm on Alex's arm. As they moved towards the patrol car, the bystanders parted, a tense silence following them. Tom opened the back door of the car, pushing Alex inside. He closed the door with more force than necessary, the slam echoing through the quiet park. Tom stood still for a moment, his hands resting on the roof of the car, trying to steady his breath. A mix of anger and doubt churned inside him. Had he gone too far, or not far enough? He needed to be in control, yet the unease gnawed at him, leaving him questioning his actions. He glanced at the bystanders, then quickly looked away, slipping into the driver's seat. The tension had not eased. It had only shifted, changing shape, but staying ever present. The car moved through the city streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Tom's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his eyes fixed forward. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost control back at the park, that Alex had somehow gotten the better of him, even in cuffs. Alex sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed, his eyes turned towards the window. He felt a mix of frustration and determination. Frustration at the powerlessness of his situation, yet determined not to let this break him. He watched the city blur past, the familiar streets now feeling distant and disconnected. He could see people going about their day, unaware of the struggle playing out inside the police car. It made him feel small, like just another face in the crowd, powerless against the system. Tom glanced at Alex in the rearview mirror, his frustration simmering. He wanted to say something, anything to reassert his authority, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. He felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him, a sense of something slipping away, just out of his reach. Alex shifted slightly, the cuffs digging into his wrists. He could feel the frustration radiating off Tom, the tension thick in the air. He let out a slow breath, trying to focus on staying calm. He knew he had to keep his composure. Any sign of weakness would only give Tom more power over him. The ride seemed to stretch on forever, the cityscape rolling by, endless and indifferent. Neither man spoke, the silence between them charged with everything that hadn't been said. Alex knew this was just the beginning, that whatever was waiting for him at the station would be another test of his endurance, and he was ready for it, no matter what came next. The precinct buzzed with activity as Tom led Alex through the entrance. Officers moved about, some barely glancing at Tom and Alex as they passed, others giving curious looks. The sight of a man in handcuffs was not unusual, but there was something about this particular scene that made people take notice. The tension was palpable, an undercurrent that everyone seemed to pick up on. Tom's grip on Alex's arm remained firm as they made their way to the booking desk. The officer behind the desk, Officer Jenkins, raised an eyebrow, his eyes moving from Tom's flushed face to Alex, who maintained an expression of calm despite his restrained hands. "What's the charge?" Jenkins asked, his tone neutral but his gaze questioning. Tom cleared his throat, his voice harsher than intended. He felt the need to justify himself, to prove he had control of the situation, even though deep down, a part of him questioned if he had made the right decision. "Resisting an officer," he replied. He avoided meeting Jenkins' eyes, the doubt from earlier still gnawing at him. Jenkins looked at Alex, recognition flashing briefly across his face. He remembered seeing Alex in a report, something about a special case, but he quickly masked it. "All right, let's get him processed," he said, motioning for another officer to take over. As they led Alex further into the station, the murmurs began again. Officers exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. Alex noticed it all but kept his gaze straight ahead. He had been in situations like this before. The judgmental stares, the whispered assumptions. He knew better than to react. He had to remain calm. That was the only way to get through this. Tom could feel the weight of every glance, every whispered word. He worried about how this would be perceived, not just by his fellow officers, but by Captain Thompson. The fear of judgment gnawed at him, tightening the knot in his stomach. His stomach twisted as Captain Sarah Thompson stepped into view, her sharp eyes locking onto him immediately. He swallowed hard, knowing this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. Captain Thompson stood in her office, her eyes narrowing as Tom entered, Alex following behind. Her desk was cluttered with paperwork, but her focus was entirely on the two men in front of her. "Officer Wilson," she began, her voice cold but controlled. "What is the meaning of this?" Tom tried to straighten up, but the weight of the situation bore down on him. "Caught him acting suspicious, Captain. He wouldn't cooperate, so I brought him in," he said, avoiding her eyes. Captain Thompson turned her gaze to Alex, who stood silently, his posture composed, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his eyes steady and calm. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, and she nodded slowly. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it?" she asked, her tone softer but still authoritative. Alex nodded. "Yes, Captain." Thompson's eyes flicked back to Tom, her expression hardening. "And did you have probable cause to arrest him, Officer Wilson?" she asked, each word measured, her gaze unwavering. Tom hesitated, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He didn't cooperate when I asked for ID," he stammered, his confidence faltering. Captain Thompson's face remained unreadable. She took a deep breath, then gestured to the handcuffs. "Remove them," she ordered. Tom blinked, caught off guard. "Captain, Now, Officer Wilson," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Tom stepped forward, fumbling with the keys before finally unlocking the cuffs. Alex rubbed his wrists, his eyes meeting Captain Thompson's. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying a weight of both relief and restraint. Captain Thompson nodded, her gaze still fixed on Tom. "Officer Wilson, we need to have a conversation. Mr. Johnson, please wait outside." The tension in the room was thick, and as Alex stepped out, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be easy. Alex stepped out of the room, the echoes of Captain Thompson's commanding tone still ringing in his ears. He stood in the hallway, taking a deep breath. The station was still bustling, but it felt quieter now, almost as if the entire building was holding its breath. He rubbed his wrists, feeling the soreness from the cuffs and letting the tension release from his shoulders. Inside the office, Captain Thompson turned her attention fully to Tom. "Officer Wilson, what were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Tom stood at attention, though his confidence was clearly shaken. He opened his mouth to respond, but Captain Thompson cut him off. "Do you understand the consequences of this kind of behavior?" Tom hesitated, swallowing hard. "Captain, I thought I was following protocol. He was acting suspicious and he refused to show ID," he said, his voice lacking the conviction it once had. Deep down, he knew he was grasping at straws, trying to convince himself that his actions were justified. The uncertainty gnawed at him, and he realized he might have acted out of fear more than reason. Captain Thompson shook her head, her expression a mix of disappointment and frustration. "Officer Wilson, we do not arrest people without proper cause. Suspicion alone does not warrant this kind of action, and you know that." She paused, her gaze piercing. "Remove someone's freedom only when you're sure. You crossed a line today. Tom lowered his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. I understand, Captain, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good, Captain Thompson replied, her tone softening slightly. We're going to fix this, but you need to understand the gravity of what you've done. Now go out there, apologize to Mr. Johnson, and release him properly. Tom nodded, feeling a mix of shame and relief as he turned to leave the office. He felt ashamed, not just for his actions, but for the realization that his judgment had been so clouded by bias, a bias that had led to a serious mistake. He knew he had a lot to reflect on, and that this moment would be one he wouldn't soon forget. Tom walked out of Captain Thompson's office, his steps heavy. He saw Alex waiting, leaning against the wall with a calm expression. Tom hesitated for a moment, gathering himself before approaching. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, regret, defensiveness, and a gnawing sense of having crossed a line he shouldn't have. As Tom reached Alex, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Johnson," he started, his voice strained. Alex looked up, meeting his gaze, his face unreadable. Tom shifted uncomfortably. I owe you an apology," he continued, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "I acted out of line. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have." Alex studied him for a moment before responding, his eyes steady and his posture relaxed. "Assumptions are dangerous, Officer Wilson," he said, his tone even. "They lead to situations like this, ones that could have ended much worse." There was no malice in his voice, only a calm statement of fact. Tom nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I let my judgment get clouded. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I wasn't." He looked back up at Alex, the sincerity clear in his eyes. "I'm truly sorry." Alex nodded slowly. "Apology accepted," he said. "But this isn't just about me. You have to understand that actions like yours affect everyone. The next person might not be as lucky." Tom swallowed, the weight of Alex's words sinking in. He knew Alex was right. This was bigger than just the two of them. "I'll do better," Tom promised. And though his voice wavered, there was a determination there that hadn't been before. Alex gave a slight nod, then stepped away from the wall. "I hope so, Officer Wilson." With that, he turned and walked towards the exit, leaving Tom standing there, a mixture of relief and realization washing over him. The following morning, Tom found himself sitting in a small, stark room at the precinct. The walls were bare, and the air was heavy with tension. A single table stood in the center, with chairs placed on either side. Across from Tom sat 3 members of the Internal Affairs Committee, their faces impassive as they reviewed the case file in front of them. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers. Officer Wilson, one of the members, a stern-looking woman named Detective Harris, began, "You understand why you're here today, correct?" Tom nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel his palms growing sweaty, and he wiped them discreetly on his trousers. Detective Harris glanced at her colleagues before continuing. "We need you to walk us through your decision to detain Mr. Johnson. What led you to believe he was a threat, and why did you feel it necessary to escalate the situation?" Tom hesitated, his mind racing to find the right words. He knew this was his chance to explain himself, but the truth was, even he wasn't entirely sure why he had acted the way he did. He could feel a mix of fear, confusion, and regret swirling inside him. Fear of admitting his mistake, confusion about why he had let his biases take over, and regret for the consequences that his actions had caused. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. I thought he was acting suspiciously," he began, his voice faltering. "He was alone in the park, and when I approached him, he refused to show ID. I thought he might be hiding something." One of the other committee members, a man with graying hair, leaned forward. "And did you have any concrete evidence to support this suspicion? Any reports or witness statements that linked Mr. Johnson to any criminal activity?" Tom shook his head, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. "No, sir," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "It was just a feeling." Detective Harris's expression remained unchanged, but there was a hint of disappointment in her eyes. She let out a small sigh, her shoulders slightly drooping, as if weighed down by Tom's words. "Officer Wilson, we cannot operate based on feelings. Our duty is to uphold the law with fairness and without bias. Your actions were based on assumptions, not facts. Tom lowered his gaze, the reality of his mistake sinking in even deeper. He had let his instincts, clouded by prejudice, guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Detective Harris's words hanging heavily in the air. Tom could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the realization of what he had done hitting him with full force. He looked up, his eyes meeting those of the committee members. There was no escaping the truth anymore. "You're right," Tom said, his voice cracking slightly. "I let my biases influence my actions. I assumed things about Mr. Johnson because of how he looked, and I let that cloud my judgment." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I see now that I was wrong. I failed in my duty to serve and protect without prejudice." Detective Harris nodded, her expression softening just a fraction, perhaps seeing the genuine regret in Tom's eyes. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step, Officer Wilson, but words are not enough. This department cannot afford actions based on assumptions and biases. We need to ensure that every officer understands the gravity of such mistakes." Tom swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He knew that his words alone wouldn't be enough to make things right. He had to prove that he was willing to change, to learn from this experience. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice filled with a mix of determination and regret. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure it doesn't happen again." The man with the graying hair exchanged a glance with Detective Harris before speaking. "This will be a long process, Officer Wilson. You'll need to undergo additional training, and there will be continued oversight of your conduct. Are you prepared for that?" Tom nodded without hesitation. "Yes, sir. I understand." He looked down at his hands, the weight of his actions still heavy on his shoulders. "I just want to be better." Detective Harris gave a small nod. "We'll be watching, Officer Wilson. Let's hope this is a turning point, not just for you, but for the department as a whole." The room fell silent once more, the gravity of the moment settling over everyone present. Alex entered the small, dimly lit room, his gaze steady as he took in the sight of the Internal Affairs Committee seated across the table. The atmosphere was tense, every face turned toward him, waiting for his words. He took a seat, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The silence was thick, expectant. Detective Harris cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming in today. We understand this must be difficult for you, but your testimony is crucial for our understanding of what transpired." Alex nodded, his expression calm but resolute. He took a deep breath before beginning. "What happened that day wasn't just about me. It was about something much larger, the assumptions that are made about people like me, simply because of how we look." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the committee members. "Officer Wilson approached me because he thought I didn't belong. He saw me sitting alone, reading, and assumed I was up to no good." He let his words hang in the air, allowing the gravity of his experience to sink in. "This isn't the first time I've faced something like this, but I hope it can be the last. Not just for me, but for others who might find themselves in my position. The system needs to change. Officers need to be trained to question their biases, to see beyond appearances." He leaned forward, his voice steady and unwavering. "I urge this department to take real steps toward reform, to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Detective Harris nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Your words will be taken into serious consideration." The room was silent again, but this time it was filled with the weight of Alex's testimony, a call for change that could not be ignored. Later that day, Tom was called back into the room. He could feel the tension in the air, a sense of finality hanging over the proceedings. Captain Thompson was there this time, her presence adding to the gravity of the moment. She looked at Tom, her eyes filled with a mix of sternness and something that almost resembled pity. "Officer Wilson," Captain Thompson began, her voice steady, "after careful consideration of the testimonies and the facts presented, it has been decided that you will be placed on temporary suspension while the investigation continues." Tom felt his heart sink, though he had expected this outcome. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand, Captain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Thompson continued, her tone firm but not unkind. Tom felt a pang of regret as he listened, realizing that she was giving him a chance to grow, not just condemning him for his mistakes. "This isn't just about punishment, Tom. It's about reflection. You need to take this time to understand the impact of your actions, to learn from this, and to ensure it doesn't happen again." Tom swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the committee on him, judging, evaluating. "I will, Captain," he replied, his voice filled with a mix of regret and determination. Captain Thompson gave a small nod. "We hope this will be a turning point for you. The department cannot afford actions based on prejudice, and we need every officer to be part of the solution, not the problem." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "Take this time to reflect, Tom. We'll be here to support you if you're willing to make the necessary changes." Tom nodded again, feeling a sense of both shame and hope. He knew this was his chance to make things right, to prove that he could be better. As he left the room, he couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one that he was determined to see through. After Tom left, Captain Thompson turned her attention to Alex, who was still sitting in the room, his expression unreadable. She took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation was just as important as the one she had with Tom. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice steady but carrying a note of sincerity, "I want to thank you again for coming forward. Your courage in speaking out has given us the opportunity to address an issue that has gone on for far too long." Alex nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm not here for special treatment, Captain. I just want to see real change. I want to be part of a system that values justice over assumptions." Captain Thompson leaned forward, her eyes filled with determination. "And I intend to make that happen. We need to make sure our officers are equipped with the training and awareness they need to do their jobs without bias. It's a long road, but I'm committed to it, and I would be honored if you would work with us to push for these changes." Alex considered her words for a moment before nodding. "If it means that no one else has to go through what I did, then I'm in." Captain Thompson smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through the tension in the room. She extended her hand and Alex took it, feeling a surge of hope and determination. He realized that this moment was the beginning of something meaningful. A chance to be part of the change he had always wanted to see. "Together, we'll make this department better. We can't undo the past, but we can build a future where every citizen is treated with respect and dignity." Alex shook her hand firmly, his gaze steady. "Let's make it happen." The room seemed to lighten just a bit, the sense of hope for a better tomorrow taking root. A week later, Tom found himself sitting in front of the Internal Affairs Committee once again. This time, the room was filled not only with committee members, but also with Captain Thompson and Alex, who had been invited to witness the conclusion of the proceedings. The tension in the air was palpable, each person bracing for the final decision. Detective Harris began, her tone formal and direct. "Officer Wilson, after reviewing all the evidence, considering the testimonies, and taking into account your actions, the committee has reached a decision." Tom's heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. He tried to prepare himself for the inevitable, but nothing could fully shield him from what was about to come. "It is the decision of this committee that your employment with the department is terminated, effective immediately," Detective Harris said, her voice firm and unyielding. "Your actions have shown a lack of judgment and an inability to uphold the values that this department stands for." Tom felt a cold wave wash over him, his worst fears confirmed. He nodded slowly, unable to find words. He looked up at Captain Thompson, who met his gaze with a steady, unflinching expression. There was no malice there, only a deep disappointment. "Officer Wilson," Captain Thompson spoke, her voice softer now, "I hope you take this as a chance to reflect and grow. This doesn't have to define you. What matters is what you choose to do next." Tom swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I understand, Captain." He turned to Alex, his eyes filled with regret. "Mr. Johnson, I'm truly sorry." Alex nodded, his expression serious but not hostile. I hope you learn from this, Officer Wilson. We all have a responsibility to do better. Tom stood, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew he had lost not just his job, but also the respect of his peers. As he walked out of the room, he felt the eyes of everyone on him, each gaze a reminder of the consequences of his actions. The room remained silent for a moment after Tom left, the gravity of the decision settling in. Captain Thompson turned to the committee. This isn't just about one officer. We need to make sure that this kind of failure never happens again. I will be taking steps to implement the reforms we discussed, including mandatory bias training for all officers, regular community outreach programs, and establishing an oversight committee to ensure accountability. Detective Harris nodded. We're all on the same page, Captain. This is a chance to rebuild and to do better for the community we serve. Alex looked at Captain Thompson and then at the committee members. Let's make sure this is the start of real change, he said, his voice filled with determination. Bookmark. Captain Thompson gave a firm nod. It will be. We owe it to the people we serve and to ourselves. In the weeks that followed, the precinct was a place of transformation. The walls that once held a rigid, cold atmosphere now displayed posters about equality, respect, and justice. Notices for new mandatory training sessions on implicit bias, community engagement, and de-escalation tactics were pinned to the bulletin boards, signaling a new chapter for the department. Officers moved through the halls with a mix of caution and curiosity, their routines disrupted by the sweeping reforms Captain Thompson had promised. Morning briefings now included discussions on implicit bias, and patrol shifts were adjusted to allow time for community outreach activities, illustrating the department's new priorities. Each officer was required to attend seminars designed to confront and dismantle unconscious biases. Role-playing exercises pushed them to experience perspectives they had previously ignored, while community leaders were invited to share their experiences and build bridges between law enforcement and the public. Captain Thompson walked through the precinct, watching as her officers sat in the training rooms, listening attentively to the guest speakers. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but the commitment was there. She could see it in the focused eyes of her team, the genuine questions they asked, and the determination to learn. This was a start, a necessary first step towards rebuilding trust. Alex had agreed to be part of the reform process, often joining the training sessions to provide his perspective. During one session, he spoke about the fear and frustration he felt during his wrongful arrest, and how a simple change in approach could have prevented it. His words left a profound impact on the officers, prompting some to reflect openly on their own actions. He spoke candidly about his own experience, not to accuse, but to educate. His words resonated, creating an environment where officers felt safe to acknowledge their shortcomings and strive for better. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The atmosphere in the precinct slowly began to shift. Conversations that had once been guarded were now more open, with officers discussing ways to improve their approach and better serve their community. One officer, for example, mentioned how he planned to spend more time listening during routine stops rather than rushing through interactions, while another suggested organizing a community meeting to better understand residents' concerns. Captain Thompson felt a glimmer of hope. They were on the path to becoming the kind of department they could all be proud of. As the reforms took root, Alex stood outside the precinct one morning, looking up at the building that had once symbolized fear and injustice for him. Now, it represented something different, possibility. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. Change was happening, and he was a part of it. Captain Thompson stepped out of the building and joined Alex, her gaze following his. She allowed herself a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The resistance, the long hours, and the determination it took to get here. It's starting to feel different in there, she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Alex nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. It is. It won't be easy, and it won't be fast, but it's a step in the right direction. Captain Thompson turned to face him, her eyes reflecting her gratitude. We couldn't have done it without you, Alex. Your voice made all the difference. Alex looked at her, his expression serious. This is just the beginning, Captain. There are still so many changes to be made, and so many people who need to see that justice isn't just a word, it's an action. Captain Thompson nodded, her determination matching his. And we'll keep working until everyone sees it. Alex felt a sense of purpose like never before. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and setbacks, like confronting deeply ingrained prejudices within the community and navigating resistance from those resistant to change. But the progress they had made gave him hope. He thought of the officers he had spoken to and the genuine desire for change he had seen in some of their faces. It was enough to keep him going. "Let's keep pushing forward," Alex said, his voice steady. "For everyone who deserves better." Captain Thompson smiled, and together, they stood in silence, watching as officers entered the building, ready to face the day's challenges. The precinct was changing, and with it, so was the community. It was a long journey, but Alex was ready to see it through, step by step, until justice was truly served for all. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the precinct. It was a new day, and with it came new hope. Alex turned to leave, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He knew they were far from finished, but for the first time, he believed, really believed, that change was possible. The story of Alex and Captain Thompson is an inspiring journey of the struggle for justice and change. The challenges, tensions, and decisions in each situation highlight the difference between power and responsibility, between prejudice and a commitment to improvement. Through Alex's determination and Captain Thompson's courageous leadership, this story serves as a powerful reminder that change does not come easily, but with perseverance and cooperation, positive reforms can be achieved for the entire community. If you enjoyed this story, please comment 1. If you loved it, comment 2. We'd love to hear your stories too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring stories. Share your thoughts about Alex's actions and Captain Thompson's reforms in the comments below.